The heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night declares knowledge.
Good evening, St. Luke's. Welcome to our Wednesday Midweek Lent service. We continue our discussion on healing, where today we will talk about intellectual healing with John Norman, a retired professor from the University of Wisconsin. Welcome, John. Great to have you.
Well, thank you for having me.
We've been talking over the last, by computer and then in person, about intellectual healing, and you connect science and mysticism and healing together in an unusual way. How is it that you came to do this?
Well, it's probably a long story. It might go all the way back to my childhood, but to make it short, when I retired, I realized I'd spent my life connecting different disciplines of science. And my spiritual life was more or less separate from my scientific life, and that wasn't very comfortable. And once I retired, I figured I got the time now and the priority setting ability that I can integrate these things and bring them together. So I started to explore various things. I explored myself, my inner life, did some counseling with some pastor friend of mine in the church I was going to, and I got involved in some New Age groups. I studied the Bible. I went through a lot of different processes. Mankind Project, which was a men's retreat project. I explored healing with a friend of mine, which was a fascinating experience.
Oh, yeah.
And slowly I managed to start to integrate these two fields together to my own satisfaction, probably using an approach not too different from exploring a scientific unknown, since this was a big unknown to me, how to pull these two together. And that process is still ongoing. I'm still working on it.
It's a lifelong process.
It's a lifelong process from now on to however long it lasts.
Where did healing enter into this pursuit?
Well, when I was exploring this integration process, I joined a New Age group that was full of people who would put their hands on you and tell you about yourself and tell you things you didn't know about yourself. And they told me things about me, and they said, one of the things they said was that I was a healer. Mm-hmm. I could do that with my hands. And I've known since I was a teenager that my hands do things on their own. I mean, working on a car, they would start to do things when I was stuck, and always sort of took me in a good direction. So my friend and I, who were joining this group together, got together and did some exercises in healing where I would put my hands on him. And it made a difference to his physical infirmities, which floored me, absolutely floored me. I didn't expect that, and a number of unusual things happened, and suddenly there was a tangible attachment, realizing there's something very mysterious going on here, and healing is a big part of it. And I realized that as a lifelong teacher, teaching is a form of healing itself. So that it's something that resonated with me pretty deeply. So it had to be a part of this integration process.
And that integration process to me is really interesting. Go off script a little bit, but the idea of how faith and science have become so fractured frustrates me to no end. I married a science teacher, and so I'm loosely connected to science, and I have a desire to know more. But all too often the church wants to turn on science, and science wants to turn on church. Where in reality, I think we talked about how they're kind of two different ways to look at the same thing.
Yeah.
You know?
I agree with you on that. That's true. And after working in science for 40 years, I realized that actually a scientist has a great deal of faith.
Yeah.
And it's mostly what the difference is in what a scientist has faith in and what a faith healer or a clergyman or a pastor like yourself has faith in. And in science, we have a lot of faith in the logic process. And the logic process and reasoning, which is the bedrock of science, it always starts with a premise. A premise is a fancy word for assumption.
Yeah.
And an assumption is an unprovable statement. So reason itself has to be based on faith. You have to have faith in those assumptions because you don't really have evidence for them, or else they wouldn't be an assumption.
And at the core, assumption is also there in theology. There's an assumption about the ultimate being, and you have faith in that.
Yeah.
And so I've always been frustrated how they seem to think that we're diametrically opposed, but I think, it's just two people looking at the same thing through two different telescopes.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, to a person who has a religious faith, there's something they might call revelation. People receive revelations. In science, we'd call it a creative leap of understanding. But they're both exactly the same thing.
They're both eureka.
Yeah, eureka. Right?
That's it.
I mean, we're all human, and we have more in common than we have different.
Exactly. And to me, faith is a unifying thing. And when we use it to divide, that's, I think, where we need healing. I think the church needs healing just as that's where I see intellectual healing being, that the church realized that that's not something diametrically opposed to the church, but it's part of the church.
Yeah. And I think the science practitioners need to deal more with healing as well.
Yeah.
One of the powerful aspects of science is how it has produced a unified community the world over.
Yes.
Scientists everywhere work on the same principles and the same methods and established procedures for doing things. And it actually exceeds their commitment to their political interests. I mean, it's a very strong unifying force. And I think sometimes the scientist is a little bit reluctant to look into himself and realize how similar what he does to what's done in religion and spirituality. It's not as different.
Now, since you've retired, you've taken on this goal of looking into faith and science, and that's a pretty big plate to take on, a good chunk to take on. How has that journey been?
Well, it's been a challenge. It's been a little bit difficult for me to have normal conversations with my colleagues because they think I've become a little bit heretical as a scientist. But so many of the unifying concepts that have come into my understanding over the last decade are as fundamental to spirituality and mysticism as they are to science. I mean, for example, we have a notion of love. I mean, love is something we all experience. It's something we associate with. We think we know what it is. It's a little hard to define.
Right.
I looked it up once in the Oxford English Dictionary, and it's 13 pages. So it is hard to define. But you can create a definition for love that incorporates all of the functioning of science, as well as the functioning of mysticism and creation, and even the Genesis story in the Bible. And it's possible. I came across this in a book, and it was a revelation to me to realize that love, something we think of as personal interactions, is more than that. It's much more than that. I mean, it's a key part of the Trinity. It's a key part of relationships. And science is all about relationships. For sure, it's about relationships.
Well, when you mentioned that about the Trinity, we were talking about this in our Genesis class. I see love as, it says God is love, and I see that as the image that we're created in, is that love that is the unifier of God. That love brings us into the Trinity too.
To me, it's critical. It's an essential piece of the Trinity. I mean, biblically, we believe that God is love. Mm-hmm. And in Genesis, at least in 1:2, it talks about how God approached the darkness. And this is sort of fascinated me, and it's something I've run into more or less recently. Somehow I missed this in a lot of the earlier readings. And in that process, out came light.
Yes.
And so in a way, the relationship between love and darkness is light. I mean, so I think love is critical. I mean, and it's all exchange, whether it's one human to another, whether it's a hug, or whether it's two billiard balls bouncing off of each other. In a way, it's all love. It's all about interaction. It's all about exchange. It's all about balancing the polar opposites of a relationship between two things.
In the church, we were always taught, and I've had a problem with this, and we discussed this yesterday, the darkness. That darkness is evil, because when we see something we don't understand, we fear it. So water was chaos, because water, the big oceans, are where people go to die. Yeah. The darkness, where there's no light, is when something bad could happen to you. Darkness is, they would see evil. But actually, as we were talking yesterday, and you just mentioned, it's out of darkness that God creates. And that the love and the darkness and that word speaking, that power, creates light. And then and one of my things I've been fascinated with is the new studies about dark matter. Like, is that the stuff of creation? And so, but that's not where we're going today. But yeah, when you touch upon that, it just excites me to no end, because it brings me right back to in the beginning. So, you talk about the intelligence of the heart.
Yeah.
How do you access that?
Well, to me, there's really several ways I can operate as a person, and I have a choice between the two. I mean, maybe this is where free will lives for me. And that is, I can operate in a mind-centered way. And that's what I need to do as a scientist. Mm-hmm. I need to operate in a mind-centered way. Or I can operate in a heart-centered way. Now, I think we all know what a mind-centered way is. I mean, when we think of ourselves as our mind, it's a mind-centered paradigm. It's a mind-centered strategy that we use to get along in the world. A heart-centered strategy is a little harder to define. And I ran into a book that explained this to me in a way that I really liked. And it talked about the 7 dimensions of the intelligence of the heart. And they're just 7 words: unity, love, life, respect, honesty, justice, and kindness. And these 7 words describe, or they're symbols for, experiences that we can have and be a part of. And there is a priority order of these 7 dimensions. And if you take any endeavor like science, if you don't conduct your science, your mind-centered science, according to the 7 dimensions of the intelligence of your heart, the science doesn't work. So when we have interactions with other people, with other things, if we are not using those 7 dimensions and centered in our heart, in a sense thinking of our mind as a servant to our heart, so we're a heart-centered person and our mind is a servant to it, then chaos ensues. If we want order to come out of the interactions that we're having, then we need to use the 7 dimensions.
Chaos is, in a way, unbalance. So rebalancing yourself, your intellectual self, brings you back to the 7 intelligence of the heart, if I said that right.
Yeah, I think that balance is a creative or a very essential part of exchange. And whether it's a loving relationship with my wife or I'm studying how insects interact with each other, or how does an insect fly, or how does water and heat transport through the soil to provide an environment that things can live in. Those things are all about exchange. And if we're talking about, say, a spiritual subject, the exchange, we might refer to this medium of exchange or this acting force for this exchange as being spirit. All right? So spirit would be a part of conducting this exchange. In science, I would call that energy. So to me as a scientist, energy is the same thing as a clergy would use the word spirit. Yeah. And this is an integrating concept.
And if you look at the language, ruach or pneuma, the Hebrew and Greek words that we use for spirit, are also the words for breath or wind, which are, in a way, to me, symbols of energy also. Yeah. Something we can't see, but there's energy there. And so I can see spirit and energy being almost transferable.
Yeah.
That the spirit is the energy of God.
And in Aramaic or in Hebrew, that's actually part of the language.
Right.
In English, that's not part of the language.
No.
We separate those things, and we think of them differently. And when I say this to my scientists, my colleagues, they're not impressed with it.
And I think that's part of where we're out of balance, because if I say what I just said to my colleagues, I know there are some who will call me a heretic. That's okay. It's been done before.
Yeah.
But yeah, I like how this helps heal, how that gets us in balance. And could you run through the seven heart
dimensions of the heart?
Yeah.
Now, the 7 dimensions of the intelligence heart, unity is what it begins with. And it makes sense it's the first piece, because really everything in the universe is connected. I mean, even as scientists, we know this. And the key to science is to understand this unbounded complexity, this infinite complexity in this universe, with the simplicity of our theories and models. I mean, that's how we come to understand this and adjust our relationship to our environment. So unity is essential to everyone. I mean, a theologian might refer to God, a scientist refers to a unified field theory. I mean, so they're both dealing with unity. It's a fundamental concept, and it sort of sits at the top of these 7 dimensions. Love is this thing that handles interactions. Doesn't matter we're talking about science or we're talking about loving someone, they're all interactions. And a definition might be something like a reversal transference. This definition I ran into was that love, the function of love, is a point of function where two complementary forces, in the presence of a third stabilizing factor, exchange modes and one becomes the other. Now, it takes a while to soak this up. I contemplated this definition for months, and it took me months to generate a single example with two billiard balls in science, because it took a while to soak this up, but it's true. And I could go through that explanation, but we don't have time now.
Right.
And it's something I've done in classes here, in the adult classes.
In a way, it's
St.
the
Luke's.
two have become one.
The two have become one. And so, in a sense, one interacting with other, with the interaction between the two, which is love, that's the Trinity bringing unity to the duality. One and other is a duality, but if they aren't interacting, nothing's going on.
Right.
So you need the Trinity. You need three pieces. We go from one unity to the Trinity through love. So that's a unifying concept. Now, if we think of love in motion, in the sense of evolution and the dynamism of life, love in motion leads us to life. But life interacting, if there's no respect in the interaction among living creatures, then chaos ensues and living creatures flounder, right? And they don't...
And consume one another.
They consume each other, and it stops. Life can stop. So these quantities of respect and honesty and justice and kindness, they're a different level of understanding or of perception for us. But they all matter. They all matter a lot. And there is an order to those, but it's harder to see.
See, and as I looked through that and read through that and talked to you about it, I saw the unity and the love being identifying who God is and how we're brought into God's relationship. Mm-hmm. And then the other five, justice, my memory isn't as good, are like attributes or what comes out of that relationship.
Yeah. And they have to do with our creative part of this relationship.
Exactly.
I mean, and so it's up to us in our interactions and in the connections that we make with other things and other people and other living forms. It's up to us to decide whether we want to be heart-centered or mind-centered. And if the mind doesn't have any references, the mind doesn't really have any references at all. It's very relative. And if you follow your mind, if you develop the skill to be able to watch your mind, this is one of the beauties of a heart-centered life, is you can actually watch your mind do its thing, think. And it'll run you around in circles because it doesn't really have any references. And that's its power. That's why it's so powerful, is because it can adapt to anything. So it's a wonderful characteristic of the mind. But it means that the mind needs a master. It's really a servant, and it needs a master that establishes the reference points. And that's the heart.
So when you have that balance, heart and mind, you're whole in a way intellectually.
You're whole. And that's, as a person, that's where holistic functioning, that's where wholeness comes from. And this has been my pursuit for a decade. This wholeness is everything to me for the last decade. Is what is it, how to grasp it, and how to connect the science and the spiritual parts of my life, which were two essential, critical parts of my life, equally important to me. And so I didn't want to sacrifice one or the other to find wholeness. They had to come together to do that.
But yeah, because if you sacrifice one or the other, that's not wholeness.
No.
That's not your true identity.
It's true. It's artificial.
And in a way, I think as a whole, the scientific community and the faith community are not whole without each other. We don't get that.
Our human community is not a whole human community.
Exactly.
It's fractured. And it's hard. References are everything in science. There is no science without standards and references. It's critical, and it's critical for everybody practicing it to use the same references. But ultimately, we only have two references, two reference points, and that's 0 and infinity. Those are the only two reference points we have, and you can't get to either of them from here. But we can access them. And the mathematicians have done almost a magical job of teaching us how to access infinity, how to use 0 to access infinity. It's astounding. We have many models for how to do this, but we don't use them in our everyday life.
Right, and we ought.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, as I found out yesterday when we had our first face-to-face talk, John and I spoke for about an hour and 45 minutes, and it felt like 15 minutes to me.
Yeah.
We've probably gone a little long today, and we're going to have to end our conversation. Thank you for joining us. I'm hoping in the future that when things clear out a little bit, we might even be able to just have a conversation day where we just sit and talk and let others eavesdrop. I would love to do that.
I would love to do that.
So I'll stay in contact with John, and I hope you enjoyed our conversation today about intellectual healing. God's blessings be with you.
Let us pray. God, we ask for the knowledge of the healing of our bodies. We know that knowledge is healing, and healing is knowledge. As we seek knowledge, we ask that you would help us find and use this knowledge and become stronger in our mission. And all God's children said loudly, Amen.
Thank you.